In the early morning of December 30th, 2006, Saddam Hussein, the former dictator of Iraq, took his final steps towards the gallows where he would soon be hanged. Just weeks earlier, a special Iraqi tribunal had convicted him for the killings of 148 Shiite villagers in an event known as the Dujail massacre. But while these killings were certainly terrible, they were not the real reason Saddam was removed from power and eventually executed. Saddam had ruled Iraq with an iron fist for decades, and throughout his reign, he was responsible for a litany of crimes, including mass murder, supporting terrorist organizations, and even waging illegal wars against neighboring nations. Yet, despite his atrocities, the United States and its allies seemed content to leave him in power. That was until 2003. So what changed? The official justification for the 2003 invasion was that Saddam was actively pursuing weapons of mass destruction. However, as more information has come to light, it's shown that there was simply no credible evidence to support that claim. So what was the real reasoning to justify such a large-scale use of military force? It turns out that just months before the second Bush administration began having private discussions about invading Iraq, Saddam did something that threatened the United States in a way that supporting terrorist groups or committing crimes against humanity never could. And while never publicly acknowledged by the Bush administration, there is a lot of evidence that suggests that this action of Saddam was a real reason for the invasion. So what crime did Saddam commit that was so terrible that Uncle Sam just couldn't look away? According to many experts, the truth was surprisingly simple. Saddam threatened U.S. supremacy by selling his oil for euros, directly challenging the petrodollar hegemony. And while at first glance this might not seem like the type of action that warranted a full-scale assault, had he been successful, it could have crippled the power and influence of the United States in ways weapons never could. And as a trapdoor released beneath Saddam's feet, his execution served as an ominous reminder to the world. Challenging the petrodollar risked deadly consequences. To understand why Saddam's actions felt so threatening to the United States, we have to go back to the 1940s, to when Saddam was just another boy living in poverty in the small village of Al-Ajwa, Iraq. In this period, Iraq's oil production was controlled by the Iraq Petroleum Company, also known as the IPC. And despite having Iraq in the name, the IPC was controlled by a consortium of Western companies, including British Petroleum, Royal Dutch Shell, and Standard Oil of New Jersey. This setup allowed these major players to dominate Iraq's oil industry and ensure that oil profits flowed to Western stakeholders instead of the Iraqi people. And when the IPC exported its oil, they sold it for British pounds sterling, the global reserve currency at the time. This benefited Great Britain in several ways. By having petroleum traded in pounds, it increased demand for their currency, which helped to stabilize their economy, made borrowing costs lower, and made all of Britain wealthier by proxy. On the other side of the world, however, major events were taking place that would lead to a chain reaction of unforeseeable events that would change Iraq forever. At this time, a group of Allied leaders were congregating in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, to design a new monetary system for the post-World War II economy. And when the conference was over, the United States established itself as the world's predominant superpower, and a new economic system was formed. The dollar would replace the pound as the world's reserve currency, and it would be backed in gold at a rate of $35 per ounce. When this deal was signed, Iraqi oil switched to being sold in dollars, and the United States started receiving many of the same benefits from controlling the world's reserve currency that Great Britain had been enjoying only a short time earlier. And while this helped to bolster the US economy, the ripple effects of the Cold War, including the wars in Korea and Vietnam, acted as a counterbalance, resulting in significant budget deficits and an increase in the national debt. By 1971, it was becoming woefully apparent that the United States was enjoying its privileges as the custodians of the world's reserve currency too much. To ease some of the economic pressures of the Vietnam War, the government had been printing more dollars than it had the gold to back. Some countries, like France, had suspected this early on and began reclaiming their gold from American vaults years earlier. realizing that one day the United States wouldn't be able to make good on their debts. And on August 15th, 1971, they were proven right. France had sent a warship to New York Harbor to collect another shipment of gold from the Federal Reserve, but the gold reserves had already been depleted to a point of no return. As a result, President Richard Nixon was forced to end the Bretton Woods Agreement and take the dollar off the gold standard. This sent an economic shock throughout the world. The Bretton Woods Agreement, which had been powering the world's economy for the past 27 years, was over. The dollar was no longer the official world reserve currency, and all the other currencies that were indirectly backed in gold through the US dollar were now backed by nothing. Governments around the world had to scramble to take control of their monetary policies and avert economic crises. Fortunately for the United States, however, even though the dollar had lost its official status, it was so deeply entrenched as a medium for international trade that in the immediate aftermath, it remained the de facto world reserve currency. But now, the supremacy of the dollar was on the clock. It was at risk of being replaced, and by 1973, cracks began emerging as all the world's currencies began to fluctuate against each other in response to natural market forces. Then, on October 6, the United States found itself involved in another military conflict that would have major ramifications on the world economy. Egypt and Syria launched a surprise attack on Israel, kicking off what would become known as the Yom Kippur War. At this time, the United States was aligned with Israel, while Syria and Egypt were allied with the Soviet Union. And just like so many other conflicts during the Cold War, each of the global superpowers immediately came to their allies' aid. At the time, the politics of the Middle East were complex at best. Each country had its own unique set of motivations and incentives, with some being more friendly to the US, others aligning more towards the Soviet Union, and others being more neutral or independent. Despite the complex and potentially adversarial relationships between the other Arab nations, there was still a large feeling of Arab solidarity. And when these countries saw the United States' swift support for Israel, they became enraged. As a response, all of the Arab members of OPEC announced an oil embargo on October 17th, where they would stop exporting oil to all of Israel's allies, including the United States, the Netherlands, and Japan. And because the Middle East exported the majority of the world's oil, when the embargo began, a massive oil crisis quickly ensued. In the United States, oil prices skyrocketed nearly 400%, and a massive wave of economic pressure caused unwelcome chaos to an already battered U.S. economy. The severity of the disruption from the embargo quickly highlighted the strategic importance of oil around the world. Unable to handle its effects, the affected nations began mounting a large amount of diplomatic pressure on the Arab nations, trying to find ways to end the embargo so that they could get back to normally running their societies. Only a week after the embargo started, a UN-backed ceasefire officially ended the war, but the embargo didn't stop. Still upset, the Arab nations stood in solidarity and continued to impose the embargo until March of the following year. During this time, the United States was actively negotiating with Arab members of OPEC, trying to figure out a diplomatic solution that would not only end the embargo, but that would help to avoid this situation in the future. Luckily, they didn't let this crisis go to waste. While the Arab nations stood in solidarity against Israel, there were still major tensions among them, most notably between Saudi Arabia and Iran, who had a rivalry that went back generations. And in this rivalry, the United States found its opportunity to not only prevent future oil crises, but to strengthen the dollar, which at the time needed all the support it could get. In an unprecedented deal with Saudi Arabia, the US agreed to sell them weapons and offer full military protection, and in exchange, Saudi Arabia agreed to sell all of its oil exclusively in dollars. Additionally, as part of the deal, Saudi Arabia agreed to reinvest their dollars into US Treasury bonds. Through this agreement, the United States reinforced dollar dominance, ensuring that all oil importing nations would be required to acquire dollars to pay for their oil needs. And by ensuring that Saudi Arabia would reinvest its dollars into treasury bonds, the United States now had a new guaranteed stream of capital that it could use to finance government projects and pay off its deficits. This was exactly the vital injection into the economy that the US needed. And on June 8, 1974, 3 months after the oil embargo officially ended, the agreement was formalized, and the United States began supporting Saudi Arabia in return for them helping to create new demand for the dollar. This was a landmark deal, and because Saudi Arabia was the largest oil exporter in the world, it sent a clear signal to the rest of OPEC. This was a new standard. Soon after, because of a mix of economic, diplomatic, and geopolitical pressure, all of OPEC was exclusively selling their oil in dollars and buying American Treasury bonds with the profits. And this process became known as a petrodollar system. From a more practical perspective, what the petrodollar system really allowed the United States to do was export its inflation overseas. The government can now print huge amounts of new dollars, and instead of the US economy having to deal with the brunt of the inflation would get diluted across the globe. It was absolutely vital to the well-being of the US economy. And while the early years of the petrodollar system worked nearly flawlessly, in 1979 a major problem began to emerge. The US-friendly Shah of Iran was overthrown in the Iranian Revolution, and his successor, the Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini, was not a fan of the West. His goals were to usurp the secular and westernized regime that had been ruling Iran and replace it with a highly theocratic and independent one. In order to do this, the Ayatollah needed to reduce Western influence, and almost immediately, he began exploring ways to challenge US hegemony, which included selling portions of Iran's oil for currencies other than the dollar. Even though the portion of oil not being sold in dollars was small, the United States understood that if this trend caught on, the risks to the American economy could be existential. They needed a way to fight back and destroy any risk to the petrodollar. Interestingly, the majority of other Arab states also saw this new Iranian regime as a threat, though for different reasons. The majority of the Arab world is Sunni Muslim, but Iran is Shia. And in the Islamic world, there is a giant chasm between the two sects. Simply put, the two sides do not like each other, and the chasm has been the reason for countless conflicts since the beginning of Islam. So when the rest of the Arab world saw a violent and theocratic Shia regime take control of a regional military power like Iran, they became afraid that the Shia influence might spread and potentially lead to a major military conflict. Luckily for the United States and all the Sunni Arab countries, the perfect counterbalance to Iran's expansion existed in the form of Saddam Hussein, the newly anointed leader of Iraq. While not a formal ally of the United States, Saddam and his Ba'ath political party had been receiving support from the CIA since at least 1959, when they aided Saddam in a failed assassination attempt of the Iraqi Prime Minister Abd al-Karim Qasim, due to his pragmatic alignment with Soviet and communist interests. Already, there was a long-seated rivalry between Iraq and Iran that went back centuries. Additionally, Saddam's secular authoritarian regime naturally drove resentment from the very religious Ayatollah. In fact, not long after the Ayatollah ascended to power, he tried to expand his influence in the region and publicly encouraged the Shia faction of the Iraqi population to rise up and revolt. Obviously, this could not be tolerated by Saddam, and for this reason, along with a handful of other related events, he launched a full-scale invasion of Iran on September 22, 1980. And because the other Sunni nations viewed Iran's theocratic ambition as a threat, when he invaded, he had the financial and diplomatic support from many other countries, including Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and Kuwait, who specifically loaned Iraq $14 billion for military spending. Additionally, while the United States officially maintained a neutral stance at the start of the war, evidence suggests that they started sharing limited intelligence with Saddam early on in an effort to give him a military edge. Furthermore, some evidence suggests that the US may have even directly greenlit the invasion. And this makes sense because the US could not risk Iran destabilizing the region and expanding its influence, as this would have likely resulted in more oil supply shocks and potentially even the death of the petrodollar, which was vital in maintaining the health of the US economy. Despite the US and Sunni support, Saddam was not able to earn a decisive victory. And as the Iran-Iraq war dragged on, Iran began looking more dominant. Not wanting Iran's influence to grow, the United States became more and more involved in supporting Iraq, publicly siding with them and providing more arms and intelligence. Eventually, the US Navy was even made responsible for protecting Iraqi oil tankers. This extra assistance did a lot to limit Iran's advances, and it allowed the war to drag on for nearly a decade. By 1988, both sides were hitting their limit. In a desperate attempt to gain some sort of advantage, Saddam used an assortment of chemical weapons on Iranian forces and Kurdish civilians in an event that became known as the Halabja chemical attack. This was the first time chemical weapons had been used at a large scale since World War II, and Saddam quickly drew international condemnation from the global community. 5 months later, on August 20th, 1988, after almost a decade of fighting and 1 million casualties, both sides lacked the will to continue on and finally agreed to a ceasefire. The war was over, and nothing had been accomplished by either side. In the immediate aftermath, Saddam faced a number of challenges. While Iraq's military was battle-hardened, its economy and infrastructure were in shambles. Additionally, his many humanitarian crimes were quickly coming into focus from the international community, and his reputation was changing from a ruthless dictator who could be worked with to one who couldn't. Then, to pile on to Iraq's hardship, the global price of oil began experiencing significant market fluctuations. All of a sudden, Saddam's most precious resource was less profitable, which made it even more difficult to get Iraq back on its feet. Unhappy with his situation, Saddam began lashing out, blaming the low oil prices on his Arab neighbors, saying that they were overproducing and that it was hurting the market. He even began asking some of his Arab neighbors for leniency on the debts he owed them from the war. Kuwait, Iraq's neighbor to the south, drew the brunt of Saddam's ire. Unlike Saudi Arabia, which was a large country and had active US military bases protecting it, Kuwait was small and much more vulnerable. They had an active military only a fraction the size of Iraq's, and additionally, they shared a 120-mile border. Seeing an opportunity to push his weight around, Saddam demanded that Kuwait cancel their debt with him, justifying his case by saying that he used that money to protect them from Iran. Not wanting to set a bad precedent, Kuwait refused. They argued that the $14 billion loan was financial assistance, not a gift or form of payment. This only inflamed Saddam even more, and instead of paying his debt, he decided to retaliate with force and invaded Kuwait on August 2, 1990, just 2 years after the ceasefire with Iran. His thought process was that he would be able to improve Iraq's economy by seizing Kuwait's assets, which included its oil fields, which were amongst the most productive in the world. Additionally, he assumed that the world would stand by, not believing it worthwhile to enter into a new war. Unfortunately for Saddam, he severely miscalculated the situation. Unlike the Iran-Iraq war, where he was needed to act as a cudgel against an expanding and anti-American Iran, now he was the one destabilizing it, and he was putting the global supply of oil at risk. And because the supply of oil and the continued usage of the petrodollar was a top-level priority for the United States, they viewed Saddam's actions as an existential threat and reacted accordingly. Within a week, a coalition of American-led forces deployed to Saudi Arabia and began establishing a massive defensive position. Their aim was to contain the war and stabilize the region in an operation known as Desert Shield. Additionally, the United Nations immediately imposed economic sanctions on Iraq, with the goal of pressuring Saddam into withdrawing from Kuwait without escalating into more military conflicts. Instead of kowtowing to US demands, Saddam acted in defiance, spreading propaganda and continuing to threaten his adversaries. He tried rallying support from other Arab nations with themes of Arab unity and Western imperialism, and when that failed, he resorted to veiled threats of more chemical weapons attacks. His efforts didn't work, and when all other diplomatic efforts failed, the United States initiated Operation Desert Storm, a full-scale, highly coordinated military assault designed to swiftly expel Saddam from Kuwait, releasing the nation from his control. While the assault worked, it was not flawless. On his retreat from Kuwait, Saddam went scorched earth, setting fire to over 600 oil wells and deliberately pumping millions of barrels of oil into the Persian Gulf, devastating large amounts of marine life. This only worsened Saddam's already terrible reputation, and when Desert Storm finished, Iraq was in an even worse position than before. The economy was ravaged, and it was now completely politically isolated. Ironically, despite all of Saddam's actions, the U.S. coalition still saw value in keeping him as a brutal leader of Iraq. This was because he ruled with an iron fist and was effective at keeping all other political factions disenfranchised and in check. The United States feared that if they were to remove Saddam as a leader, a power vacuum could occur, which could lead to a civil war, further destabilizing the region and potentially propelling a new government regime that was allied with Iran, which was now staunchly anti-American and had left the petrodollar standard. Seeing the potential threat to U.S. economic and geopolitical interests, the U.S. chose to keep Saddam in power and pursued more diplomatic repercussions instead. One of these repercussions was a complete dismantling of any and all of Iraq's chemical, biological, and nuclear weapons programs. In order to do this, a United Nations Special Commission was put together, and it successfully conducted weapons inspections, destroying large quantities of chemical and biological weapons, as well as the facilities related to their production. Additionally, severe economic sanctions were put on Iraq, banning them from all international trade with the exception of humanitarian goods like food and medicine. This ban included exporting oil, which only further crippled the already battered economy. As a result, the people of Iraq suffered immensely. Child mortality rates skyrocketed, living standards fell drastically, and Iraq's currency, the dinar, experienced hyperinflation. By 1995, the people of Iraq had suffered enough, and the nation received a bit of a break when the United States supported an initiative called the Oil for Food program, which allowed Iraq to sell a limited amount of its oil in exchange for certain humanitarian goods. While the official motivation for this program was humanitarian concerns, there is evidence to suggest that the price of oil was a motivator as well, as the cut-off Iraqi oil exports had disrupted the global oil supply and caused increased price volatility. Regardless of the true reason for the program, Saddam was now allowed to sell oil again for US dollars, in a way that helped alleviate some of his people's suffering and in a way that ensured he could not build up the Iraqi military to its past glory. Despite the leniency from the United States and the United Nations, relations with Saddam deteriorated over the next several years for a multitude of reasons. The deterioration culminated in 1998 when Saddam banned the UN weapons inspectors, and in retaliation, the Clinton administration began bombing specific targets in Iraq to degrade their infrastructure and their ability to produce, store, and deliver any weapons of mass destruction. By 2000, Saddam had not allowed any UN weapons inspectors in for years. Despite the lack of on-the-ground access, gathering intelligence on Saddam's actions was still a high priority for the United States, and they used multiple methods to ensure that he was not developing any sorts of WMDs. These methods included satellite imagery, human intelligence, and communications intercepts, and they were able to verify with a high level of confidence that there were no active attempts to develop any sort of illegal weapons. While Saddam might not have been secretly rebuilding his military, his hatred of the US had not dampened. He was irate about how much control he had lost over his own country, and more than anything, he wanted to find a way to fight back and undermine American dominance in the region. His solution was simple. He would challenge the petrodollar hegemony by selling his oil in the Oil for Food program for euros instead of dollars. He understood that the petrodollar was a cornerstone of US economic power, and that selling his oil for euros directly challenged its dominance in the oil markets. If his switch was successful, other countries might follow, creating ripple effects that could damage the United States in ways a strong military or WMDs never could. And when he made the switch on November 6, 2000, officials in Washington understood the political ramifications too, and immediately began raising concerns. At the time, however, the United States was completely focused on the highly contested 2000 election, which was taking place between Al Gore and George W. Bush, where irregularities and ballot issues forced the election to get drawn out and eventually settled by the Supreme Court. When all the dust was settled, George W. Bush was named president, and as soon as he entered office in January 2001, he began having private discussions, plotting ways to oust Saddam. However, there was a giant problem. Forcing a regime change in a country as large and important as Iraq was a massive task. It would require a military invasion, it would cost tons of money, and perhaps most importantly, it would require a huge amount of public and international buy-in. At the time, though, most people simply didn't think selling oil for euros warranted a full-scale invasion. For the American public, outside of a handful of bureaucrats and economists, very few understood how much of an existential threat this really was. And for many of America's top European allies, they were actually benefiting from this situation. The motivation for invading Iraq did not exist. The Bush administration needed some type of black swan event to convince the public that invading Iraq was necessary. And on the early morning of September 11th, 2001, they finally got it. On that day, a group of al-Qaeda terrorists hijacked 4 commercial planes, crashing 2 into the World Trade Center towers in downtown Manhattan and another into the Pentagon in Washington, D.C. This was the largest terrorist attack in history, claiming nearly 3,000 lives and injuring thousands more. Around the world, people watched in shock as the Twin Towers, symbols of American strength and dynamicism, collapsed live on television. When the dust finally settled and Americans had their fill of mourning, calls for justice filled the ether. Those responsible for the attacks had to pay. Quickly, all of America's allies started rallying behind them. Within weeks, a U.S.-led coalition of over 40 countries kicked off an invasion of Afghanistan in an effort to destroy al-Qaeda and root out the Taliban, the political party which had been protecting them. At this point, the United States had the full support of the global community. It was essentially a given that the U.S. had a mandate to exact justice on those responsible for the attacks. And with the huge groundswell of support for military action, the Bush administration saw an opportunity to shift attention to Saddam Hussein and Iraq by expanding the scope of the mandate from bringing justice to those responsible for 9/11 to defeating terrorism altogether. Bush called it the War on Terror and quickly began publicly connecting Saddam to terrorism more broadly, as well as generating concern about Iraq and weapons of mass destruction. In January 2002, during his State of the Union address, Bush famously escalated his rhetoric, coining the term axis of evil, referring to Iraq, Iran, and North Korea. To many casual observers still angry after the 9/11 attacks, the war on terror and the axis of evil felt natural, as the idea of fighting terrorism was incredibly popular. To many experts in the area, however, this new rhetoric seemed odd and out of place. Iraq and Iran, 2 of the 3 members of the axis of evil, were bitter enemies, still angry at each other over the Iran-Iraq war. Furthermore, while the UN Special Commission had not conducted a weapons inspection in several years, significant amounts of intelligence was still being gathered, and there was no credible evidence that Saddam had or was trying to create weapons of mass destruction. Finally, and potentially most importantly, there was zero evidence of any connection between Saddam Hussein and either al-Qaeda or the Taliban. Despite this bizarreness, Bush escalated his rhetoric, attempting to justify an invasion to both American citizens and the global community. Unfortunately for Bush, while the global community had fully supported the American response in Afghanistan, support for an invasion of Iraq was much more difficult to come by. Simply put, other countries understood that there was no evidence of WMDs, and they knew that Saddam was not linked to 9/11. Some foreign leaders even spoke publicly about their skepticism. French President Jacques Chirac suggested that the urge to invade Iraq was likely driven by economic and geopolitical motives, hinting at the defense of the petrodollar. Even with the drop in support, Bush and his administration continued on pressing the issue, publicly claiming that Saddam was a threat to Western society. Finally, on March 17, 2003, nearly 18 months since the start of the War on Terror, in a televised address, Bush gave Saddam an ultimatum. Saddam and his sons had to leave Iraq within 48 hours or face the full wrath of the United States military. Just like when Saddam invaded Kuwait, believing that the US wouldn't get involved, it was now evident that he had miscalculated his position once again. Saddam began selling his oil for euros, hoping to challenge the dollar and US interests, and the US retaliated with a show of force far greater than he anticipated. The Bush administration created a multi-year-long campaign that not only highlighted all of his brutal actions as a dictator, but also went above and beyond, creating a false narrative, exposing him as someone linked to jihadist terrorism and as someone that was pursuing weapons of mass destruction. And they pushed this rhetoric until they had enough internal and global support to justify a full-scale invasion. For Saddam, there is now no way out. 2 days later, Bush stuck to his word, and the US military began a massive aerial bombardment, incapacitating major portions of Saddam's regime. Soon after, coalition forces crossed the border from Kuwait in a ground invasion, and by April 9th, Baghdad had fallen and Saddam was in hiding. While he managed to evade the US military for several months, he was eventually apprehended by US forces on December 13th, where he appeared completely disheveled with a long, scraggly beard and unkempt hair. And while the capturing of Saddam made headlines, he was now inconsequential. By this point, the goals of the invasion had already been achieved. Iraq had already begun exporting oil months earlier in September, and now they were exclusively selling it for dollars. Saddam was handed over to an Iraqi special tribunal, which officially tried him for crimes against humanity and executed him in December 2006. And while his death was certainly warranted, the real reasons for his removal from power were obvious to many expert analysts. Saddam threatened the United States by challenging the petrodollar hegemony. And despite all of the terrible things he had done in the past, that was a crime that the United States couldn't tolerate. And as punishment, Saddam paid with his life. Interestingly, while Saddam certainly lost his battle, his challenge to petrodollar supremacy may not have been in vain. The Iraq War harmed the United States' economic and geopolitical position in several ways, costing the government over $1 trillion in direct costs, damaging the U.S.'s credibility, straining alliances, and highlighting the limits of U.S. military power. Since then, multiple powerful U.S. adversaries and even some U.S. allies, including Russia, Iran, China, and the UAE, have begun moving away from the petrodollar and experimenting with other currencies to sell their oil. If this trend of de-dollarization continues, the effect on the United States and its economy could be devastating. While the U.S. may have been willing to protect the petrodollar on a massive scale in the past, the idea of starting another war over the petrodollar seems implausible, because both the United States' geopolitical position has weakened and the countries leading the efforts to dismantle the petrodollar are far stronger than Saddam and Iraq ever were. Whatever happens, one thing is clear. The petrodollar remains essential to the United States' economic stability, and any change in the system will have impacts that not only affect the US, but the entire global economy.